Nobody doubts Israel will retaliate after Iran's missile strike on Tuesday night, the second this year so far. How could it not, given the scale of the attack, the death and destruction it would have wreaked had it succeeded from a hostile power committed to Israel's demise? What we don't yet know, but we'll soon find out, is the nature of the retaliation. For Israel has options, some with dangerous downsides. Most dramatic would be an attempt to cripple Iran's facilities for developing nuclear weapons. The regime in Tehran is on the back foot, and it might well be concluding that a rush to get the bomb is the only way to restore its power and prestige in the region. That's what makes this option a tempting target for Israel. President Biden has counselled against, but given no reason. Whether Israel has the capability to degrade Iran's nuclear bomb program without US help isn't clear. Another option is to take out Iran's Karg Island, Iran's only oil exporting facility. Israel certainly has the ability to do that. It would cripple the Iranian economy and might even lead to regime change in Tehran, a welcome prospect for Israel. But if Iran retaliated by hitting other oil facilities in the Gulf, it would lead to a spike in oil prices and a replay of 1973 and 1979, when oil prices quadrupled and the Western world was thrown into recession. Bye-bye Keir Starmer's go-for-growth strategy. Less dramatic would be an attack on Iran's missile sites. It could deplete its arsenal and destroy its rocket launchers, thereby reducing but not eliminating the threat of another Tuesday night. Then there's the fourth option, the one we don't know about, the known unknown. Remember, this is Israel, which managed to weaponize the pagers and the walkie-talkies of the Hezbollah leadership. Who knows what it could do to those at the top of the Iranian regime, or what else it has up its sleeve. As I said yesterday, nobody who matters in Tehran can be sleeping soundly these days. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio. So what's going through Benjamin Netanyahu's mind at the moment? How will he decide Israel's next steps against Iran? What are his instincts? Will he follow them? Elon Levi was an insider in the Netanyahu government. He's a former spokesperson and media advisor. He joins me now from Tel Aviv, and we're grateful that you are joining us on what we know is an important holiday for Jewish people, and particularly, of course, in Israel itself.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon. Let me start by asking this. The former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett says, and I quote, "Israel has the greatest opportunity in 50 years to change the face of the Middle East." What do you think he means by that, and do you agree?
The root cause of the conflict in the Middle East is that Israel is surrounded by enemies that seek its destruction and annihilation. Since October 7th, we have been fighting a war on 7 fronts against the Iranian regime and its proxy armies. On any given day, we have rockets coming from 4 or 5 different directions, and this is truly a fight for our lives. That's the feeling inside Israel. Iran is determined to destroy Israel. Israel doesn't want to be destroyed, and, something has to give. So I think after Iran's major ballistic missile attack the other night, Israel has 2 choices. Neither of those choices is to do nothing. One is to restore deterrence, a serious retaliation that will make clear to the Iranian regime that there is a price for its aggression, that it cannot hide behind its proxy armies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and that if they continue attacking Israel, the cost will come to them too. After the last major ballistic missile attack in April, Israel was pressured to take the win. Hiding from rockets and fending them off isn't taking
by Mr. Biden.
Right, it's sent, and by the UK as well, under the Conservative government. And I think that sent Iran the message that it can continue shooting rockets at Israel, and that's the new normal. As long as Israel, with a coalition of Western armies, can shoot down the rockets, we have to get used to the fact that every once in a while we come under ballistic missile attack.
Sure, I understand that, but let me bring you back to my question, which is, what does Mr. Bennett mean by changing the face of the Middle East and the greatest opportunity to do that in 50 years?
And that brings me on to the second option. The first is to restore deterrence. The other is to say there has to be a serious change in the order in the Middle East, and that means striking Iran's nuclear facilities. Iran is now a nuclear threshold state. I don't want to think what would have happened the other night if Iran had fired 200 ballistic missiles at Israel while putting a nuclear umbrella over its terrorist groups. It is now much weaker and much more vulnerable than it ever thought it would be. It built up Hamas and Hezbollah to protect the regime, and the regime just fired 200 missiles at Israel to try to protect Hamas and Hezbollah. So there are voices in Israel that say the root cause of the problem in the Middle East is the Iranian regime's aggression, its destabilizing activities, its proxy armies surrounding Israel and determined to destroy it. And after Israel has crippled Hezbollah, destroyed possibly half of its missile arsenal, killed off its entire senior leadership, this is the time to take the fight directly to the Iranian regime instead of allowing it to rearm, regroup, and resupply those proxy groups across the Middle East. It's a terrible strategic dilemma.
I understand, and I understand the argument behind that. And yet President Biden urged Israel not to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. It was interesting that that was the one option he picked on, even ruling out the kind of element of surprise that you might have. I mean, why do you, given that America is also frightened of a nuclear-armed Iran, why do you think he specifically tried to rule this out?
President Biden said that in response to a question from a reporter who put him on the spot and he had to give a yes or no answer. I think the United
That's what
States
we do.
is still, right, yes, good job. I think the United States is still hopeful that it is possible to reach a diplomatic solution, but we need to be clear what diplomacy needs to do. Diplomacy needs to isolate the Iranian regime, stop its aggressive military activities. And when I say destabilizing activities, I mean, for example, arming the Houthi pirates in Yemen who are sending, grocery prices in Britain soaring through the roof because they've hijacked global commerce through the Red Sea. That needs to end. One of the options Israel will be considering, of course, is a potential attack on the nuclear facilities. And the question is, is the world going to allow Iran to become a nuclear weapons state? That's a truly terrifying prospect.
I understand. So let me ask you this. Does Israel have the capabilities to seriously degrade Iran's nuclear facilities without American assistance?
Israel has demonstrated in recent months that it has a very powerful air force that can reach anywhere in the Middle East. We saw after the Houthi pirates shot a drone at Tel Aviv a few months ago that killed one of my neighbors just down the street. Israel sent warplanes to the port of Hodeidah in Yemen, which is a further distance than Iran itself. But
Indeed.
this isn't something
but you will know this isn't just a matter
alone.
of distance. I mean, I perfectly understand you can do the distance, but that's not the issue. The issue is, do you have the bomb capacity, the bombing capability to hit facilities which are buried deep underground without U.S. assistance?
Israel has bunker buster bombs, but you're right, this would be an enormous challenge, and it would require the continuous supply of munitions from our allies. The quest of stopping Iran, the Iranian regime, from becoming a nuclear weapon state is not something that should fall to Israel alone. By the way, by way of historical context, in the 1980s, Israel destroyed Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. I think the whole world is grateful that Saddam Hussein didn't develop nuclear weapons. In the mid-2000s, it destroyed Bashar al-Assad's nuclear reactor just before it went online. And thank God Israel took out Syria's nuclear reactor just in time. But if the Iranian regime, which is sworn to Israel's destruction, chants death to America, death to Israel, arms terrorist groups that attack British interests as well, is at risk of becoming a nuclear weapon state, that is not something that should fall to Israel alone. That requires a serious international response, including from the United States.
But it might.
Including from the United
But
States.
it might. It might, because the international community is still urging you for ceasefire or whatever. You could have to do this on your own. Now, you know Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's interesting that you yourself have zoomed in on hitting the nuclear facilities as the option, which seems to be uppermost in your mind. It seems to me that the reason that it's an option uppermost in many Israelis' minds is that if Iran's on the back foot at the moment, if Iran did get a nuclear capability, that would change the balance of power in the region. So do you believe that this option, the nuclear option, is one that Mr. Netanyahu will be seriously considering?
An option, definitely. Israel has been clear that it will never allow any enemy regime to acquire nuclear weapons. Whether that would have to be in response to the major ballistic missile attack we saw on Israel the other night or down the road, I don't know. But Israel has said, as a matter of strategic doctrine, we will not allow enemy regimes that are calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. We won't let them get the weapons with which to do it. Now, that's not necessarily the leading scenario. There are other options, as you mentioned in your introduction, possibly targeting Iran's oil infrastructure, possibly some other strike on the Revolutionary Guard facilities. But one thing is clear, Israel's response cannot be simply to sit on its hands and say, well, we'll turn the other cheek, because that is what happened in April. And the lesson that Iran drew from that is that it can attack Israel with impunity, and ballistic missile fire that forces 10 million people, a whole country, into rocket shelters can become the new normal. That is the lesson that Iran drew from last time. And that's why it's important that the US is now saying there have to be severe consequences. Notice, Andrew, that's a shift in US rhetoric as well. They're not saying take the win. They're saying there have to be severe consequences for this aggression.
Well, it was the US Defense Secretary that said that, not the president.
It was Jake Sullivan as well, the National Security Advisor.
And Jake Sullivan, but not the president. I mean, in your assessment, or in a general assessment in Israel among informed commentators, how far away is Iran from being able to deploy a nuclear bomb on a ballistic missile?
Very close. Iran has enough highly enriched uranium for at least 4 nuclear weapons. It has over 160 kilos of highly enriched uranium at 60%. That's only a short technical step from enriching it to the 90% you need for nuclear weapons. The US believes that it can, at a time of its choosing, militarize that and build nuclear weapons at multiple facilities whenever it wants. Essentially, it is a question of decision by the Iranian leadership to take the enriched uranium it already has, enrich it that little bit further, and assemble it into a weapon. The US intelligence says that Iran has been conducting research that is shrinking the knowledge gap that they will need to have the technical know-how to build a nuclear weapon. It is potentially very, very close. And that is a nightmare scenario, not just for Israel, not just for Saudi Arabia and the UAE that are maybe even more worried about this than Israel is, but for the whole world, that you could have a fundamentalist religious regime in Tehran that cries death to America, death to Israel, that arms international terrorist groups like Hamas, like the Houthis, like Hezbollah.
Indeed. No, right. I get all that. I get all that. And we know all that. So let's take what you say at face value. If Iran is very close to having a nuclear capability, if it is true how that would change the balance of power in the region, then surely the option is clear. Forget Karg Island, forget missile launch sites, forget other things that you might hit. Surely the logical option now is for Israel to do what it can to degrade that nuclear bomb program. Why would you not?
And for some policymakers, that is the obvious choice. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is saying now is the time to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. We have a window of opportunity because its proxy armies are on their knees. Hezbollah, Hamas have been massively degraded. We're not going to get another opportunity. But this is, of course, going to incur massive costs if this were to happen, because Iran has a fearsome ballistic missile arsenal, and it has armed these armies on 7 fronts against us. And an all-out war with Iran, what would it mean for Israel? It would mean simultaneous missile attacks from Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and attacks from terrorist groups in the West Bank as well. This is a scenario that Israel will be very keen to avoid because it is absolutely the last resort. We've been under attack on 7 fronts since October 7th, and we don't want to continue being under attack on 7 fronts. We want this war to end. Our problem is we need this war to end in a way that our enemies are not still located with their terrorist armies, with their ballistic missiles, right on our borders, able to continue importing and building more weapons and ready to fire them at a time of their choosing. So yes, it may be a question of strategic necessity at the very last moment if there's no other choice, but it would be a very dangerous scenario that Israel will be keen to avoid.
All right, we'll leave it there, and I'm sure events will unfold. Thank you, Elon Levy, for joining us on this important day in the Jewish calendar. So we've had some insight there into the thinking in Israel. But what about Iran? We're going to take a look at that next. You're listening to Times Radio.
It's pretty damaging, Andrew. And the reality is, the Iranian regime is sort of catching up with something. For decades, it's gotten away with saying a lot of big words about Israel, threatening it with destruction, but without getting a direct confrontation with it, which would also mean a direct confrontation with the United States. Now it faces their reality, that the pushes come to the shove. It's now in the threat of a direct confrontation, and the Hamas and Hezbollah that has spent decades and billions of dollars of Iranian people's treasure on building these groups up, have showed to be of little effect. So it's a very dangerous situation for Iran, frankly, and things are not looking good for the regime either.
So, despite the hostile rhetoric coming out of Tehran, I think I agree with you that you get the feeling that the Iranian regime hasn't really got a huge appetite for war. So why do you think it decided to attack Israel and expose itself to what is now likely to be serious retaliation? Did it just feel that it would have a serious loss of face among its proxies and supporters if it did nothing?
Yeah, it faced a loss of face, but also, frankly, it was so looking weak to Netanyahu himself, right? If you look at, one of the last things Netanyahu did before the attack was this message to the Iranian people that he gave, in which he even said, the day of freedom for the Iranian people is going to be not so far. So the regime, I think, felt that if they don't do anything, Netanyahu might attack them anyways, so that they might try to do this to try to prevent it. It's a terrible, and the reason they don't want a direct confrontation is that they're not as stupid. They know Iran doesn't have the sort of conventional military capabilities that are any match for Israel's. So they've tried to delay this day forever. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei, the guy who is responsible for all of this, he would have liked to delay it for his entire life, I think. But he couldn't do it anymore, and he's 85, so he doesn't have a long time left. So now here we are.
Well, I mean, we don't talk a lot about this, actually, but you're right in what you say, that Iran really isn't equipped for an all-out war. Its land army would be largely irrelevant in a clash with Israel. Its Air Force flies fighter jets from the Shah's time. It doesn't have the industrial base to churn out missiles at speed and scale. Its air defenses would be quickly overwhelmed. But I'd like to put this point to you. Would it be accurate also to say that the Iranian people themselves, as opposed to the regime, they have no appetite for all-out war with Israel because they don't really share their regime's deep anti-Semitism and desire to wipe Israel off the map?
Absolutely. Iranians really don't share some sort of an animus toward Israel, much less than other places. And, I say this often, it's the Iranians don't share animosity toward Israel, just like they don't share animosity toward Tanzania. I mean, it's a country over there. It doesn't have a historic conflict with us. We have no reason to be in fight with it. A lot of people don't even know a lot about it, until the recent conflicts. For the regime, for the minority of regime sort of devout supporters, this is a very important cause for them. But there's no reason for us to have. We've never had a conflict with Israel. We've never had a problem with Israel. There's no reason for our national interest to be, in this situation of possible confrontation with Israel and the United States and all the allies that will come with it. This is not our fight. And I think that's how a lot of Iranians feel. And they're very angry that their government has put them in danger of a war that they want no part in.
Now, of course, under the Shah, Iran was quite an ally of Israel. And I mean, going back in time, I mean, you're the historian, even to antiquity, I mean, Persians and Jews are two of the oldest, most sophisticated cultures in the world. I mean, they've got a long historical association and mutual respect for each other. And there was there not, a huge Jewish community in Persia for many hundreds of years?
There are many links between our countries. You're right, between our peoples. There still is quite a sizable Jewish community in Iran. It's not as sizable as it once was, but there is, something between 10,000 to 20,000 Iranian Jews. And Iranian Jews in Israel, when I visited Israel, the Iranian Jews are very proud of their Iranian heritage. They were so happy to see, I'm from a Muslim background. They were very happy to see a sort of Iranian Muslim, but they share the Iranianness. Under the Shah, though, I want to say, Iran did have relations with Israel, but it also had excellent relations with Arab countries. In fact, Shah has stood for the two-state solution. He has stood for the Palestinian state. It was very clear, talking to Israelis, that they need to end the occupation of the Palestinian territory. So in a way, Shah had a position similar to Saudi Arabia today, already back in the day. And he said at the time that, Palestinians and Arabs will find out that they have to live with Israel. They have to, they can't, this sort of foolish dream of getting rid of it is not going to happen. So Iran, what I think as an Iranian, what I'd like to see for Iran is to play a mediating, peaceful role, which is our tradition as a non-aligned state. But the Islamic Republic has turned, our country and this tradition of non-alignment and peaceful and mediating role to a supporter of these militias that bring nothing but insecurity for us and have put us in this danger. And they've, of course, wasted billions of our dollars and brought economic isolation for Iran. It's really been a disastrous policy under Khamenei and this regime.
But if Israel was to mount a major retaliation in the days ahead of perhaps taking out the oil terminals at Karg Island or the missile bases and rocket launchers, or probably most ambitious of all, to try and degrade the nuclear bomb facilities that Iran has. What, in your estimate, would that do to public opinion in Iran? Would that seem an outside aggressor and therefore rally opinion behind the regime? Or would it make the regime even more unpopular?
This is a great question. I've thought about this a lot. And I want to be careful here because we're talking about a nation of 85 million different views. I'll tell you myself as an Iranian, I'm very worried about the possibility of war. I hope it really doesn't happen. I think it leads to unpredictable consequences. It could destroy our infrastructure. It could result to sort of a civil war. So I really hope we don't see it. But if I'm just going to be honest with you, there is definitely a proportion of Iranians. Now, I don't know whether it's 20%, 30%, but there's a proportion of Iranians who would even view this favorably. I think that personally, that's sort of irresponsible. But there are those. But as for rally around the flag, I think what we'll have is a polarization that the 15 to 20%, 10 to 15% base of the regime will be even sort of, organized more against Israel. But I think the majority of the population who are opposed to the regime would even be angrier at the regime. So I don't think you'll have that sort of right on Frank, but it depends on the specifics. It depends on the specifics of a possible attack. Of course, if they attack your country, at some point you have no choice but to defend it in some ways. But the regime would not. And let me also say this. When I say, we say regime and the people, it's not just regime and the people. I think a lot of people in the regime, in the establishment, they're very mad at Khamenei, and they're very mad at these leaders who've gotten our country. Iranians are proud, patriotic people. And it's a sort of a disastrous policy for us to be in this situation of a possible war for no reason. As I said, we don't have any problem with Israel. We don't have a shared border with Israel. We don't have any conflict with Israel. Why should we in a war with a country 2,000 kilometers away? They have a conflict with Palestinians, with Arab peoples, and we can have whatever opinion we have about that, but it's not Iran's fight, and it shouldn't be. And I think that opinion is shared, frankly, by even a lot of people in the Iranian establishment, that I've spoken to over the years.
Freebie Gate continues to haunt the Prime Minister. Every time he tries to close it down, he just gives it stronger legs. Today we learned he'll repay £6,000 of hospitality and gifts he's received since becoming Prime Minister. But he'll keep more than £40,000 of suits, football tickets and dresses for his wife. and still enjoy a complimentary box at Arsenal matches. Whether his cabinet colleagues should hand back their free goodies, we don't know. It's just one of many unanswered questions, but at least it got him on the front page this morning. I don't think that's where he really wanted. Let's speak to Tim Shipman, chief political commentator for the Sunday Times. Tim, why is Mr. Starmer making such a hash of this? Is it just that he's not actually a very good politician, or is it a consequence of what seems to be a pretty rudderless, divided Downing Street?
I think it's partly both of those things, Andrew. I mean, this is a new Prime Minister. He's not terribly experienced in politics, a bit like Rishi Sunak. He got the job without having to sort of do a very long and tedious climb up the ministerial ranks where you learn, you make your mistakes when you're fairly obscure, and then you're exposed at the top. And I think what is concerning a lot of Labour people is that Starmer himself doesn't seem to have a very fingertip feel for the politics of all of this, and that his operation has been initially slow and flat-footed to respond to this in any kind of coherent way. And now they seem to be sort of flailing around trying to make good on it, but in a way that is merely drawing attention to it again. And as you say, asking just as many questions as it answers. People are totally perplexed. I've got WhatsApps on my phone here, from senior people who just say Downing Street is still too reactive. They're not making the weather, and you've got a very serious, military and war situation in the Middle East. Why on earth are they inserting themselves into the news cycle again?
There's a whole flurry of speculation around Mr. Starmer at the moment. It can't be the case, surely, that only a couple of months in, he's actually in some trouble.
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of rumours. I think, as best as I'm aware, a lot of them are nonsense. But because they've handled everything in a slightly sort of defensive crouch, there's not a lot of confidence in that operation in Number 10. I mean, those of us that went to the Labour conference recently, if you're a Sunday journalist like me, you spend most of your time not watching what's going on the stage, but having meetings with members of the cabinet, lunches and dinners and coffees.
Yes.
And I think I would say half of the cabinet that we spoke to had it in for Sue Gray, the Chief of Staff. The other half were broadly protective of her. But I think pretty much all of them thought that the communications operation was a total shambles and think that Number 10 itself is not yet functioning as it should.
This handing back or paying back 6,000's worth of freebies, what's the logic? Is there any logic to this? What was the point of doing this?
I mean, they seem to be saying that things he's taken as Prime Minister are different from things he took as Leader of the Opposition. But I don't think that's sort of 100% true in terms of what they've accepted and what they haven't. They seem to be suggesting that some of his clothing is acceptable and some of it isn't. They seem to be suggesting that going to Taylor Swift is not appropriate, but him continuing to go to the football is, because that's such an integral part of his life. I mean, Gordon Brown was a massive football fan and he watched it on the television.
So like most people.
Well, indeed, like most people, that's the experience of most fans. They tune in and do it like that. And Starmer seems reluctant to accept that taking on the job involves some sacrifices. They now seem to be saying, well, we won't do so much of this. But the same rules are not applying to members of his cabinet. And somebody's just messaged me to say that on another broadcast outlet recently, a minister said, well, I'm not going to get into it. We don't want to discuss it. We're not going to say what the difference is between us and the Prime Minister. So they still don't have a coherent line. And people are being sent out to talk to people like yourself without knowing what Downing Street expects them to say. It's absolutely crazy.
And meanwhile, the Labour peer, Wahid Ali, who's bankrolled most of the freebies and goodies, it seems, for the Labour Party, he stumped up the cash for them, more than cash, suits and apartments and houses and all the rest of it. He's now in a spot of bother himself with the House of Lords, I see.
Yeah, that's right. He's being investigated for whether or not he's declared everything correctly. And this is, again, a sort of symptom of a group of people who have not been exposed to the glare of publicity. Opposition is tough. Everyone acknowledges that. Really, all you've got going for you is what you say. It's very difficult to make the weather. But it also means that lots of things fly under the radar. And when you get into Downing Street, you go from having almost no scrutiny to having lots of it. And it's not just Starmer, but a lot of the people around him, some of the ministers, and clearly Wahid Ali. I mean, he's been in the House of Lords for a long time. He ought to know the rules. But when you've got every investigative reporter in the land and a fired up opposition that sees an opportunity to get back into power in 5 years' time, cranking up its attack operation, you've got to be whiter than white. You've got to make sure everything goes in on time. You've got to make sure all the rules are abided by, because if they're not, someone will find out about it. And I suspect a lot of things have been sort of ignored, and Labour got used to kind of getting away with a few of these things, and they frankly don't like the scrutiny they're getting. But they need to raise their game, and that includes, everybody in the upper echelons of the Labour Party, not just Starmer himself and those who are immediately working for him.
And it's made worse, I think, because in the times of Tory sleaze, when the Tories were in power, and there were tons of things to criticise them for, but Labour were so pious and sanctimonious about it when they did these criticisms, including Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. I mean, they all played the part of being roundheads rather than cavaliers. And that kind of attitude and that pious approach, it has come back to bite them, I think, in public opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right. Starmer made a choice to go very hard on Boris Johnson, not just as a rule breaker and a guy who'd written the rules that he himself broke, but as a sort of moral degenerate. And you heard some pretty punchy stuff from Starmer in the House of Commons about, how Johnson had let down everyone that he ever came into contact with, and that sort of veered into comments on his private life as well as his public life. And I think it has two effects, this, Andrew. One of which is that, they made a political decision to do that, and now, the boot's on the other foot. But I do think there's a sort of inherent belief amongst a lot of people on the left that they know they're good people. They know what they're trying to do is good and worthy, and they benefit a lot of the time from the public thinking that people on the right are cynical and semi-corrupt. And that helps them politically. But the Labour Party does, to an extent, believe this. And it thinks it's better than this, and it knows that it can't be corrupt because it's packed with good people. In the same way that Jeremy Corbyn knew he couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic because he'd been an anti-racist fighter all his life. Yes. And now Starmer, playing the sort of goody two-shoes card, he's now facing that kind of scrutiny. And it's not just that the political boot is on the other foot, but that crime of hypocrisy, I think, certainly in the Westminster Village, is the thing that's really costing them. Out there, I think the public broadly sees the Tories and the Labour Party, the political establishment, as all the same. And I think Starmer doesn't quite understand that, because in Westminster, he feels that his people are, the good-intentioned folk, the moral folk. But he doesn't understand how much this cuts through, I think, because out there, the public sees a bunch of cynical, freeloading, money-grabbing politicians in Westminster, a sensation that was greatly weaponized by the expenses scandal back in 2009. And I think Labour people who think they're better than that are in for a rude shock, because the public doesn't see them like that. And I'd be very surprised, in 3 or 4 years' time, I doubt anybody in a focus group is going to mention Sue Gray or her salary or any of that stuff. But I bet they remember Free Gear Keir and the problems that he's had around these donations. It's the sort of thing that the public sitting in the pub understands. And I think Labour has made some pretty grave errors in the last 2 or 3 weeks, because it hasn't understood that it isn't different in the public eye from the rest of the people who've been running the country for the last 15 years.